Okay, well, I think we're live. Gabe, it's so nice to see you. Greetings from Toronto.
Well, hello from Sydney, Mary.
Very appreciative of World City and from our friends at Resonance to ask us to come and be with the virtual World City audience during this really interesting moment where we're going to take stock of what have we learned from COVID and what are the really big challenges that we need to continue to address. You and I have been fortunate that we've been part of a kind of global call that has happened episodically through the pandemic, led by Tom Wright from the RPA, who's probably in the audience listening to this in New York. And thanks, Tom, for your leadership. And we've had a chance to compare notes on a fairly regular basis because we haven't had the same experience of COVID. And even though it's fundamentally been an urban challenge everywhere, it's been different. And I think that's partly why Chris and Jen from Resonance invited us to be part of this conversation, because they want us to share a little bit about our sort of perspectives. Of course, you are an American transplanted into an Australian environment, and I'm a dual citizen back living in Toronto, having spent a number of years in American cities. So you and I both bring a slightly different perspective. But I might just start with asking you a question, if I may. You know, December 10 is going to be the 1,000th day of COVID, living with COVID. 1,000 days since the World Health Organization declared a international emergency. And part of what I'm thinking about, and part of what my colleagues here at the Canadian Urban Institute are thinking about with our partners across Canada, is what do we think the COVID dividend is going to be? What is that going to look like when we look back, the way we look back on the influenza epidemic in 1918, or the cholera epidemic in London, or something I'm very familiar with, the levee failures in New Orleans. Out of those extraordinary experiences, there was a moment of reckoning, and then there were some learnings that stuck, that transformed the way that immunization was handled, the way that water quality was controlled, and the way that resilience is planned in communities. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought at all to this in terms of the Australian experience, and also with all your colleagues around the world and in the United States. What do you think we need to be paying a special attention to? What do you think the learnings are that we should really, what is that COVID dividend that we should be harvesting and really doubling down and investing in? Have you given any thought to that?
Well, of course. And Mary, what a great question to start with. We've all been thinking about this for 2 years now, at least.
Yeah.
How is COVID going to change the world? How is it going to change cities? And yeah, as a Californian who spent all of COVID in Australia, here in Sydney, we were sheltered and trapped from the ravages of COVID. They would not let us off the island. But also life went on much more like normal. So we have watched everything in America, you know, George Floyd and COVID and all of it from a great distance. The thing is if the culture is changing in North America and it's changing in Europe, that ends up affecting Australian cities anyway. So even though the trauma that we've gone through is much less because they managed to shut the borders, because there's a great public health system, because people here trust the government and pulled together, and it's a basically functioning social democracy. So for all of those reasons, the trauma was less, but the cultural changes are going to affect everybody. The thing about the COVID dividend is, I suppose it's not inevitable. It's not a force. It's a choice. It's an opportunity to think about what you might want to do differently. And so I think that's where you see some cities, you know, Paris, which we've all been reading about, and chose to use the opportunity of COVID to completely remake its streets. So I think that's the question that all of us face now is, what are we going to do different? From your perspective, Mary, what would you say the COVID dividend for Toronto and the other Canadian cities is going to be?
Well, Interestingly, I think Ontario, for the benefit of our international listeners, Ontario is the province or the state in which Toronto was located in the center of Canada. I think this jurisdiction had the longest lockdowns of any. And so we were confined to barracks, no family coming in at Christmas. It was a much more, when I go to my sister who lives in Syracuse, New York, I just came back from there. When I talk to my American colleagues about their experience, as profound as it was, and as you just suggested, Gabe, I mean, there was tremendous fatalities and extraordinary pressure on healthcare systems, and we've experienced that here as well, but certainly in the United States. But they haven't had the lockdown experience. The decisions that were made by the state and federal governments across the country, across the world, to contain the virus varied. But it does mean, I would say, where I don't know if we're going to be able to fully know what the impact has been on those kinds of measures that were taken to contain the virus. So for us, businesses were shuttered. And what we're seeing here, and I'd be interested for you to talk to us about what the experience is in Australian cities, people are still very anxious, and they're not coming back to their offices in the numbers that we might have hoped. So working from home is an option for a privileged percentage of the workforce. Lots of folks have no choice. They can't work from home. But there are lots of office workers and commercial people that work in commercial spaces that are loath to come in and don't necessarily see the merits in coming in. And they're less convinced, for instance, of the arguments around productivity or camaraderie or efficiency, and or even creativity. I think I heard an interview with a younger person, just saying younger, who basically said that the notion that adjacency contributes in a favorable way to creativity and productivity was sort of a myth. And this was a young person saying that. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, like that is the fundamental premise of urban life, is that by being adjacent to one another, we mutually bring each other stimulation and benefit, and we have an interdependence with one another. And so I would say, for me, one of the critical questions that we need to think about is what kinds of infrastructure, social, physical, do we need to be investing in? We need to, I think, take serious stock of that and say to ourselves, what are the resilience networks we need to put in place so that we can troubleshoot together in safe ways? Because we can't just, we can't survive as individuals. You and I don't believe in that. We believe in collective problem solving and collective experience. So I think that to me is a really interesting question. How are we going to, what are we investing in to enhance the collective capacity to continue to solve problems, whatever they are? So
great.
That has implications in terms of governance, because we had lots and lots of decision making that was taking place in Canada anyway, that was being taken at the federal level at a far distance from the local municipal community level, where the real challenges were being felt and experienced, and where the solutions, in my view, lie. And you had people making decisions about investment, funding, government policy at such a distance. So sorry, long answer, but I think we've got to tighten this up and get more resourcefulness and resources empowered into local communities. That to me is a very important takeaway.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's a lot in that, Mary. One of the things that we've talked about a lot is how good it would be if people in the US knew more about cities in Canada and Australia.
Yeah.
And the stereotype of Americans as not knowing very much about other countries is obviously true for some people, not everybody. But what's so relevant for this moment, I think, learning a little bit more about Toronto and Sydney and Melbourne and Vancouver and all the others, is that these so-called New World cities have a lot in common, culturally and physically. Compared to the great European capitals, these are cities that were largely built out in the age of the automobile. And so the challenges of urban resilience and the experience of urban life, we have a lot in common. And then given that commonality, are making some quite different choices. This is a moment when I think we're really asking some big questions about what are cities for. Were people only in cities because of the productivity benefits, because it was good for their careers? Or do people like to be in cities and will choose to be in them and choose to have an urban social life, even if they're no longer forced to be in there? We're going to discover that. I would guess we will find that the answer is different for different cities, and that the cities that provide a very wonderful quality of life, the cities that find a way to be affordable, are going to continue to do all the good stuff that cities do, regardless of how remote work plays out. We may discover that there were some other cities where people really were going there just because it was good for their careers. And if they have the choice, they
not so much.
They move out. And so I think there's going to be a really interesting sorting there. What I observe is there's such a focus now from the developers and the city governments on making reinventing the office, making it be a place of collaboration rather than heads down work time, which is great and welcome, and that should happen. But the problem isn't the office. The problem is the commute.
Yeah.
The reason people don't want to go in, it's not because their office isn't nice enough. It's because of all the time they get back, not having to commute. And
so if they could live closer.
Well, this is exactly where I'm going. I think we're going to see that the cities that have solved that better are going to be better positioned moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you say, there's a whole bunch of factors, and you and I chuckled a bit about this at the very beginning in spring 2020, when there were all sorts of prognosticators saying that's it, it's the end of the city. And I remember thinking, boy, oh boy, oh boy, I experienced this in New Orleans. It takes a lot to kill a city. There is a lot that goes on in that self-organizing ecosystem that nobody's the boss of a city, nobody controls it. And so I think even if some governments may have tried to constrain a city, for instance, it often, there's something about the pulsing nature of human beings, humanity congregating, we get up to something when we're together. And so I think you're right that we need to pull it apart a little bit. It's not as simple as, make the office look like that, or make the commute feel like this. Maybe you're quite right that we had a problem before COVID, that people were not able to find housing close to their workplace. And so they were having to buy housing or secure housing or rental further and further away, which made the commute further and further. And so that's the actual problem, as you suggested. And is COVID going to catalyze us to rethink that? And so, for instance, the notion of the 15-minute neighborhood, which has its flaws, I appreciate, but the idea that we should actually try to intensify more. And certainly, don't you think the climate pressures that I just talked about, Houston, no potable water, the climate pressures are now catapulting upon us, and we can't afford to continue to consume land and continue to have the sort of practices that contribute to climate change. So I'm wondering if there'll be a confluence of all those things, and we're now going to see an uptick in mixed use, adaptive reuse. I don't think it's the end of the world at all to start thinking about commercial office space being repurposed for different kinds of things. Are you starting to see that in Sydney and in Melbourne?
We're not seeing it at all.
You're not, eh? Okay.
Yeah, and maybe we will. But one of the interesting things, Australia has a higher rate of population growth than the United States by a lot. Much higher rates.
Babies, or because people are moving there?
because people are moving here. And so what is widely believed is going to happen is office values may come down a bit, but all that means is just a delay of 5 or 10 years and they'll fill back up at worst. And I think the prediction is that the second tier office markets may suffer more. As you would know, this idea of converting commercial office space doesn't work that well for the post-war buildings that have big floor plates. It works a lot better for the pre-war buildings. I think it remains to be seen whether post-war office buildings in cities where the office demand really goes away get converted or whether they get torn down.
Oh God.
And I'm told by people who have run the numbers, it is a lot cheaper to tear them down than convert them.
But the sad thing is, if the cheapness is what's going to influence us, then shame on us. But I hear you on this. You know what? The only thing I would say about this, we have a project that we're doing with CMHC, the National Housing Entity Authority, Canada Mortgage and Housing, on conversions and looking at the feasibility. And we've heard initially all this hesitation. Oh no, it's too expensive, the floor plates. But I don't want to underestimate the smartness of designers who really,
it may be solvable.
They can make, what's that expression? They make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And I bet you when in the olden days, when people were saying, hey, we can repurpose factories and make them into living spaces, people said, oh, no, you can't possibly. They don't have the HVAC system. There were probably a gazillion excuses. So
I hope that's right.
I don't want to count that out. But what I think we have to talk about, we could just stay here all afternoon and chat, which is too bad that we can't. But and we're sorry we're not in New York with all of you being able to talk in the corridors about what the topics that we're just raising and not able to resolve. But I would like for a minute to talk about a topic that you wrote about and which became a very popular piece here in Canada, which I phoned you about a couple of times and said, just so you know, your name's being bandied around all the time. And that is housing. And we are seeing ourselves in Canada, and I think in other major North American markets anyway, confronted with a significant mismatch between the demand, a certain kind of demands, different kinds of demands for housing choices and what the market is able to supply, and also just a profound manifestation of lack of supports for people who are in core housing need or have mental health challenges and need a different kind of supportive housing environment. So talk to me a little bit about your observations. You wrote a lot about this when you were in San Francisco. You were in one of the most challenged markets who was experiencing this long before. Now everybody else is. What's your take on that?
Yeah, okay, great question. And I should say that Sydney has not solved this. It does some things better, but some things worse. It's interesting. There's very little affordable housing in Australia, but there's also very little homelessness. There's some, but compared to North America, and it's because they have two things. Everybody has free healthcare. And there is something called Commonwealth Rent Assistance, which is the equivalent of Section 8 vouchers. But the program is uncapped here. So everybody who's eligible gets a voucher, which is not the way it works in the US. So those two things probably go a long way to meaning that there is far less abject destitution and untreated mental illness and all those other things.
Could it be any simpler? I mean, we have healthcare here in Canada as well, but we still have significant homelessness. So you're saying that if you have accessible free healthcare and not big waiting lists and access, so not just free, but available. And you're suggesting that if there is a voucher in the hands of a tenant, the market can actually create the units for that tenant to access?
I guess the answer is not always. Of course, there is a big need for more affordable housing here, but it is mostly, the system here is mostly keeping people off the street. They may be severely underhoused, they may be living far from where they want to live, they may be couch surfing, but the numbers of people that are on the street are a tiny fraction of what you would see in US cities.
And in Canadian cities too.
Yeah.
Through the pandemic, we've just seen a rapid increase, and it's actually affecting the perception of downtowns and the perception of certain Main Street neighborhoods. People don't feel safe. They feel that there's an uncertainty that affects people going into their jobs, but also tourists and business tourists. And so it's complicated, I know.
Yeah, that's just not happening here. I mean, one thing to say on the housing production side that's interesting, in Australia, local governments don't have very much power, and federal government has a lot less power. Power is really concentrated in the states.
Yeah.
So Sydney is in the state of New South Wales. Melbourne is in the state of Victoria. The states can approve housing. And so there's a pattern where all around the rail stations, there are these clusters of tall buildings that were not approved by local governments. They were approved by the state government. And
okay, so let's talk about that. So you're saying that it was devolved from the national government to the state government or the provincial government, and then the provincial government can make those decisions and sounds like do transit-oriented development without the local government getting involved, which means presumably they can blunt NIMBY.
That's right. There are certainly NIMBYs here, same as everywhere, and yeah, people are attached to their neighborhood staying the way it is, but very often those decisions are made by the next level up in government. So it's that different institutional design has translated into a different metropolitan form, where there are it's classic TOD clusters of tall buildings all over around the rail stations.
And one of the things that's interesting about that from the Canadian perspective is that we struggle with what I would call coordinated regional planning, because we have local government, we have a couple of regional second-tier governments across the country, but it's not that common. It's mostly a local government, municipal government, and then a province, and then the federal government. And of course, transit and housing and economic development actually are really regional issues. The border, the job doesn't stop across a little street from one jurisdiction to the next. And we don't have the mechanisms as much. We don't have any formal mechanisms to catalyze that kind of coordinated development. Do you, or has in fact the state just stepped in and taken that authority? And so is it clear if the citizens are unhappy with what's going on, they blame the state, basically?
Yes, the state has taken over what the North Americans would call regional planning.
Does it work?
Yes and no. There is no problem of fragmentation here, but that doesn't mean people make the right decisions.
Right.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't.
And sometimes they consult well, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Yeah, but definitely, I mean, one of the things we always worked on in the San Francisco Bay Area was fragmentation of public transport, 27 different transport operators with their own boards and CEOs and schedules and planning departments and websites. There's only one here. It's Transport for New South Wales. And so there's no fragmentation, but that doesn't mean everything is a utopia. It's still human beings who sometimes make wrong decisions.
And how is it paid for? The state pays for it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. When you ask Australians, what are the funding sources for that new metro line you're building? They look at you like, what are you talking about? The answer is, oh, it's in the budget.
The state budget.
Yeah.
The state budget. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
they don't have separate revenue sources.
Yeah. They don't think about which pocket it's being taken from.
Yeah.
So listen, as we round the corner, because we've only got a few more minutes, thoughts from you on what you think is ahead this year. What are you going to double down on? What are you at the Committee for Sydney, corralling energy and focus on? What do you think is around the next bend?
Yeah, great question. Well, Australia just had a change in national government a few months back. And so it has done a 180-degree turn on climate action. All kinds of things are now happening, making up for a lost decade, which is quite wonderful to see and important for the world. So we're going to be doing a lot of work on that.
What kinds of things, Gabe?
Yeah, we are. We just this week launched a major piece of research on what will it take for Sydney to hit its 2030 Paris climate targets,
Great.
which it is not on track to meet, and we laid out the options for getting there. The next project for us is looking at, it's more in the adaptation space. We're looking at what do we do with development that is in the wrong place today because of flooding and fires and heat, and some of those very difficult problems that cities all over the world are grappling with. We will, of course, be working a lot on housing and transport and public space and all the core issues for us. Mary, what's ahead for you for the next year?
Other than making sure that we get you and your committee for Sydney to come into North America and do a kind of exchange. Part of what you and I have talked about, and you just said, you want Americans to learn more about. I feel so strongly that, cities are about ideas. You and I know that. And the way that economies grow is cities trade with one another, and they trade ideas, and they trade money, and they trade product, and they trade service. And so the more that we can, and what I appreciate about World City is you're getting these dialogues going between all of us. But now we need to think about what other platforms do we need for practical learning? Because I don't think, not to be too draconian about it, but I don't think we got that much time. I think we got to start to learn faster.
Yeah, there's a real urgency.
And innovate faster. So what I would say for us, not dissimilar to you, is how are we going to square the climate justice challenge? Because we've got, as we know through COVID, vulnerable populations suffered disproportionately. Climate is going to continue to exacerbate the struggles for vulnerable populations, for communities that have been historically disenfranchised because urban life has structured itself in Canada in a colonial way. So it has excluded people, and we see that affecting racialized communities and Indigenous communities. So it's a serious, serious challenge for us here to try to figure out how we're going to do that. And my gut instinct is to always be pushing down, looking at subsidiarity and looking at ways to resource and empower local communities to solve their challenges. And then for people like you and I and other intermediaries working in many of the people that will be in the audience in New York, about how do we then elevate and amplify the things that are working in local communities so that all of us can learn and that we adapt more quickly. So that's, to me, what the COVID dividend is to really learn faster and be able to accommodate change more quickly. And I think we did. We had to at the beginning. And so we've got that. We do have the capacity to act more nimbly. And I don't want us to settle back into some kind of something, Right.
COVID showed that we can change very quickly. We can spend big money to protect people and to lift people out of poverty. It showed that all these things are possible. So we need to now just apply that.
Yeah. And, we have basic infrastructure staring us in the face. We at CUI are focused on main streets. We have a big campaign called Bring Back Main Street. We've been focusing on downtowns. We're working with anchor institutions like libraries and health centers and community centers and faith institutions and parks. And, we actually have the bones of a kind of collective organism of mutual support. We have an ecosystem. So I think we just have to get back to focusing on where do we need to invest in the ecosystem to make things work. So nice to see you.
All right. Thank you for the conversation. Bye, everyone.
Always a pleasure. Nice to see you, Gabe, and all the best, everybody in New York.